Flash Cube. Only.
It's December 1975 in a research lab in New York. A 25-year-old engineer named Steve Sasson is about to show his bosses something that, in hindsight, will be remembered as one of the most important inventions of the 20th century. The device he built looks nothing like a camera. It's the size of a toaster. It weighs almost 8 pounds. It has a lens which was scavenged from a Super 8 movie camera. It needs 16 batteries to run and a tangle of circuit boards wired together by hand. To actually use it, you need both arms and about 30 seconds of patience, because that's how long it takes just to write a single image onto the cassette tape which was stuffed inside it. Sasson points it at a lab technician named Joy Marshall. He presses the button, and 23 seconds later, somewhere inside that tangle of wires, exists the world's first digital photograph. Here's a part of the story everyone already knows, or rather they think they know. Kodak invented the digital camera. They panicked because it threatened their film business, so they buried the technology, and that decision ended up killing the company. It's a great story, but it's also not quite true, because what actually happened is stranger, it's certainly slower, and a whole lot more useful. Because it really isn't a story about how one bad decision ended up killing a company. It's a story about how a company that saw the future perfectly, clearly, they built it, they patented it, even sold it eventually, but somehow they still managed to walk straight into bankruptcy. That's the version worth understanding, because it's the version that could happen to almost any successful company out there, including the ones that think they're being smart. To understand why Kodak's executives reacted to Sasson's invention the way that they did, you have to understand what Kodak actually was in 1975. It wasn't just a camera company. It was very close to a monopoly. By the mid-1970s, Kodak controls somewhere around 90% of film sales in the United States, and roughly 85% of camera sales, period. If a photo was taken anywhere in the US during that era, there's a real chance it was shot on Kodak film, processed with Kodak chemicals, and eventually printed on Kodak paper. The company had built an entire vertically integrated empire around a single repeatable transaction. You buy the camera once, but you buy the film over and over for the rest of your life, every birthday, every vacation, every single Christmas morning. This is something called the razor and blades model. You sell the razor near cost, because the real money is in the blades you sell forever after. Kodak's cameras were almost identical. The film was the business. And film, unlike a camera, was consumed and repurchased constantly, which meant the margins on it were incredible. By 1966, the model that had made Kodak the fourth most valuable brand in the United States, behind only Disney, Coca-Cola, and McDonald's. The company pulled in about $15 billion in revenue that year. At its peak market value in the mid-1990s, Kodak was worth around $28 billion and employed more than 140,000 people worldwide. In its hometown alone, Kodak's local workforce had peaked at over 60,000 employees, more people than the city's 3 largest employers today put together. That's the company Steve Sasson walked into in 1975 with a toaster-sized box that didn't use any film at all. Sasson's invention worked by capturing light through the CCD sensor, converting it into digital data, and recording that data onto a standard cassette tape. To see the photo, you'd plug the tape into a separate playback unit connected to a television. It took 23 seconds to record one black and white image at a resolution of about 100 by 100 pixels. When Sasson eventually demoed it for Kodak's executives, his account of that reaction was that it was met with curiosity mixed with skepticism. No one clapped, nobody understood it as a breakthrough. By his own description, the feeling in the room wasn't excitement, it was something closer to unease. A scary look at what could be possible in the future, in his words. People in the room didn't ask him how it worked, they just sort of stared at it. Now, here's where the popular version of the story usually jumps to the villain moment. Kodak panics, shelves the invention, hides it from the world to protect film. That's the clean narrative. The real one is so much more messier. Kodak didn't bury the camera. They patented it in 1978. And Sasson didn't get reassigned to a closet. He kept working on digital imaging research inside Kodak for the next decade and a half. By the late 1980s, his team had developed what's often described as the world's first true digital consumer camera prototype. Management chose not to commercialize it. So the failure wasn't a single dramatic decision in 1975. The failure was a pattern, repeated for roughly 20 years. Keep researching the thing that could replace film, keep deciding it's not yet worth threatening the thing that pays the bills. One Wharton Business School analysis later summarized the underlying logic quite bluntly. Accustomed to extremely high film margins, the company just kept trying to protect its existing cash cow instead of building what the market actually wanted next. That probably isn't stupidity. That's just a company being rational about protecting a 90% profit margin business, one fiscal quarter at a time, for 2 decades, until the decisions added up to something that looks, in retrospect, like the dumbest call in corporate history. While Kodak was quietly sitting on its own invention, the world had started to catch up. Sony and Canon launched their own digital camera products within just a few years of Kodak having a working prototype, gathering dust internally. Kodak didn't enter the consumer digital market until 1993. By some accounts, not until 1995 with a release called the DC-40. By the time it showed up, Kodak wasn't introducing a category, it was already chasing one. Meanwhile, the company's actual core business, film, was under attack from a different direction entirely. Fujifilm. In 1984, Los Angeles Olympics offered Kodak the chance to be the official film sponsor. Kodak, comfortable in its own dominance, declined. Fuji took the sponsorship instead and used it to plant its flag in the American market that Kodak had always treated as untouchable home turf. Over the following decade, Fuji undercut Kodak on price and fought for shelf space in major retailers, growing its US market share from around 10% in 1990 to about 17% in 1997. A price war between the two companies dragged Kodak's revenue down from nearly $60 billion in 1996 to about $14.4 billion the very next year. So picture Kodak's position in the late 1990s. The film monopoly was being chipped away by an aggressive competitor, and the digital technology that could be its next act is something it invented, but consistently treated as a side project rather than the future. 2 slow leaks in the same boat, and leadership bailing water out of only one of them. Now, here's a part of the story that almost nobody brings up, and it's the part that makes this so much more interesting than a simple "they should have gone digital sooner" lesson. Kodak did go digital, and for one shiny moment, it worked flawlessly. By 2005, Kodak had clawed its way to becoming the #1 seller of digital cameras in the United States. 2 decades after Sasson's prototype, Kodak's own invention had finally become Kodak's own product, and Kodak was shining. It didn't matter, because digital cameras as a category simply did not carry anything close to film's margins. Film was a business where you sold the same customer, the same product, over and over forever at incredibly high margins. A digital camera was a single hardware purchase with thin margins, made once and maybe replaced every few years. Kodak had essentially traded a lifetime subscription business for a one-time hardware sale, and discovered that winning at the second thing couldn't replace what it was losing from the first place. And then just 2 years after Kodak finally took the crown in digital cameras, Apple released the iPhone. Suddenly, nobody needed a separate device to take pictures at all. The standalone camera market that Kodak had spent 30 years fighting to enter and then dominate started to evaporate entirely, devoured by a product category that didn't exist when this whole story even started. Kodak's share of the US digital camera market collapsed from 24% in 2005 to 15% in 2007 to just 7% by 2010. And none of those declining shares were even profitable to hold. Kodak had spent 2 decades trying to protect itself from one disruption, only to finally win that fight just in time to get blindsided by an entirely different one that it never saw coming. It's tempting to tell the story as a tale of corporate blindness, executives too dumb or too greedy to see the future staring them in the face. But that's not what happened, and that version is actually less useful to us because it lets you believe that this could never happen to a company that's paying attention. Kodak was paying attention. They invented the disruption themselves in their own lab 15 years before any competitor had one. They patented it, they kept developing it internally for 2 more decades. They eventually launched it and they eventually won the market they'd been so afraid of. Every individual decision along the way was defensible, even almost rational when you consider it from inside a company protecting a 90% margin business 1 quarter at a time. The failure wasn't lack of vision. It was a structural inability to act on a vision that threatened the thing currently making all the money, until acting on it stopped being a choice and started being an emergency. That's the pattern worth watching for in any industry, not just photography. The threat to a dominant company rarely shows up disguised as something obviously dangerous. It shows up looking like a toy, a curiosity, a side project nobody claps for in the demo room. The company that built Sasson's camera had every piece of information it needed to win the next 50 years of photography. What it didn't have was a reason, in any given quarter, to choose the toy over the cash cow. By the time that calculation flipped, in true and rational terms, it was already 8 years from bankruptcy.
Eastman Kodak's filing for bankruptcy is one of those stories that requires a whole bunch of perspective and explanation because you hear bankruptcy.
By 2010 and 2011, Kodak was running out of road. It tried selling off hundreds of its patents to raise cash and struggled to find buyers willing to pay what the company needed. Film sales, once the engine of the entire empire, had fallen roughly to a tenth of what they had been just a decade earlier. By January 19th, 2012, Eastman Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The company that had once been worth $28 billion and had employed almost 150,000 people worldwide was now buried under billions of dollars in debt, and it had no realistic way to repay it. Later that year, Kodak finally found buyers for its patent portfolio, same digital imaging patents that trace back to Sasson's lab work decades earlier, selling it and licensing them for about $525 million to a group of companies that reportedly included Apple and Google. It was, in a strange way, the final monetization of the invention Kodak had spent 37 years deciding what to do with. Kodak emerged from the bankruptcy in 2013, but as a fundamentally different company. The consumer photography business that had defined it for over a century was gone. What remained was a smaller operation focused on commercial printing and packaging for other businesses. A business-to-business technology vendor wearing the name of what used to be one of the most recognizable consumer brands on earth.